Good evening. It is October 31st, 2024, the vigil of the great feast of All Saints. I'm Brian McCall, and I'm happy to be joined once again this week by Murray Rundus, our production manager and editor here at Catholic Family News. And this is really an election special preview roundup. So we're going to spend a significant chunk of time at the beginning on the coming presidential election. This is a few days of a vigil, the last few days of a novena that we mentioned to you a while ago that was requested by the Society of St. Pius X, U.S. District Superior, to pray for our country leading up to the elections. We're in the final days of that novena. So we're going to spend some time looking at the closing message of the campaign. Meanwhile, though, some things have been going on in the church in addition to what's been going on in the world. And first, we're going to go to the Synod on Synodality wrapped up its work, and it produced a final document. We'll let you know our thoughts on that final document. Some strange things happen in its final days. The process is really kind of strange, plus some strange things that are in it, as well as a bizarre mascot unveiled by the Vatican for the Jubilee year. These things get weirder and weirder. Then we have old trad stories in new garb. Some roundup of a couple stories in the traditionalist world. One about a really old idea from 1988 being touted as a new idea, and more kind of defections. So we'll let you know about those. Then finally, we'll head over to locals for our premium subscribers and talk about new persecution of the traditional Carmel in Arlington, Texas. We've been reporting on the sisters down there for over a year, and there's a new big development in their story that just happened this week. So we've got a packed show. This may be a longer episode. We have a lot to get through. But before we get into those stories, as I said, we are on the eve of All Saints' Day, this great feast, which was instituted to celebrate in one day all of the saints, not only those who get their own day on the calendar, but as we know from the martyrology reading every day and from Butler's Lives of the Saints, there are many, many, many saints, more than would fit on the calendar. And this is the day, the feast for all of them to be celebrated. I actually was at Mass today and over at the school here, and one of the priests at the school offered a votive Mass for All Saints' Day, because it was a ferial day on the calendar, to get the children ready. They obviously won't see the children tomorrow. They're off at school. So it was a chance to discuss the feast in anticipation, and really gave a beautiful sermon on why we venerate the saints. They are intercessors for us. They are role models for us. They are guides. They really are close to us and assist us on our road in the church militant, and really urge the children to pay more attention to their patron saint and speak to their patron saint, ask their patron saint who has a particular connection to them. That's why, particularly with our last 4 children, we discovered the European custom of really naming your children after multiple names, not just one name or 2 names, but for centuries Catholics 4 or 5 names. Why? Because they wanted so many patron saints to have connections. And it's funny. I tell people a lot, when you name a baby, give them these names. You only know them for a few moments when you name them, but it's really interesting with children to watch the children take on characteristics of one of the names in their patronage, one of the names you give them. It's funny. We've seen that with all of our children, right? Our Joseph as a child, my wife used to say, he's so quiet. He's a man of few words. Right? He's very sort of quiet, but would say certain profound things. Right? We had another one we named after little Saint Hugh, who was martyred for singing the Alma Redemptoris, the won't mention on YouTube, let's just say the non-Christians in a certain part of the town attacked him and murdered him because they were enraged by his singing of the Alma Redemptoris. He died a martyr for him for singing. And I remember when he was little, my wife, I came home one day from work, she said, I just can't stop this kid from singing. He's driving me crazy. All he does is sing all day. So it's really, there's sort of funny stories, but really it's a reminder, a little sort of human reminder that these are saints, that particular saints you give your children as names to model their lives after, and to have a close connection to their stories. And they should all know about the saints about whom, or after whom they're named. Then the church, so beautifully, we get this beautiful connection with Christ the King. We talked about last week, the church militant, Christ the King in the world today, the church triumphant tomorrow, and then the church suffering on All Souls Day. It's one of 2 days in the liturgical calendar when every priest can say three different masses. So he can say three masses, not just as a need for the faithful, but any priest. So even if you're in a monastery, you don't need multiple masses to service faithful. Each priest can say three private masses. Christmas Day and All Souls Day are the only 2 days. I guess it's an interesting connection. Why are the church wants even more masses to pour out upon the Holy Souls? I remember my wife has a little book collection of stories of the Holy Souls, different Holy Souls who had appeared to people through time. And there's one story I thought was interesting, that the one Holy Soul, when they appeared, said that when Mass was being offered for them, their pains in purgatory ceased. They were given sort of a reprieve from the suffering of purgatory during the time of that Mass, in addition to it helping them along to attain perfection and go into the bliss of heaven. So our actions here do affect the Holy Souls. We can obtain a plenary indulgence during the first day, 1st through the 8th of November, by visiting a cemetery, and on November 2nd by either visiting a cemetery or a church and saying that Our Father in the Creed, plus the usual conditions for a plenary indulgence: confession, communion, prayers for the Pope, detachment from sin. So great opportunities coming up. Then we're going to be rounded off after those 2 great days with a great saint. You want to tell us about the saint day coming up?
Yeah, definitely. I'm very happy to be talking about the saint, Saint Charles Borromeo. This is a saint that's really not talked about a ton, right? I mean, he's of course, a very influential saint, a very important saint, but he doesn't get the credit I think he deserves in many ways. So, Saint Charles Borromeo, you can view him through a number of different lenses, a number of different angles, but I really want to focus on him being this facilitator of the Counter Reformation, this counter revolutionary. And he's one of the writers, or one of the main influences on the Catechism of the Council of Trent, one of the cornerstones of the traditional movement to this day, but also just Catholicism as a whole, is this Roman Catechism. He played a brilliant role in that, and it was an incredibly intelligent man. But one of the things that I love so much about him is he was so connected with the English Catholic movement at the time. So of course there was this persecution of Catholics and in England. And if you watch our interview with David Allen White, Dr. David Allen White, there's an interesting note where there's this defense of whether or not William Shakespeare was a Catholic. One of the things involved in that is that his father, what was discovered is, in the household there was a manuscript discovered that was lost. It was sort of hidden in the roof, and what it was a confession of faith that was said to be written. He wrote many of them by Saint Charles Borromeo. He had delivered this to certain English missionaries, English priests, to go to England, find these crypto Catholics, these Catholics that were keeping their faith. And if they didn't know how to write, they could make a confession of faith and just sign their name. And they could make a Catholic will and just sign their name, just put a mark on the sheet of paper without knowing how to read or write. And so it was discovered that Shakespeare's father had actually signed one of those wills written by St. Charles Borromeo. So an incredibly influential figure. And we as English-speaking Catholics certainly should have a connection to him, because he went out of his way to help the English Catholics there in what at the time was a nation that was falling away, a nation that used to be full of beautiful monasteries, beautiful churches, but unfortunately went to the darkness of heresy. But we still have the memory of St. Charles Borromeo and those great English martyrs and saints that followed the good example, and are the reason why many still English Catholics are around today.
And it's interesting. We talked a lot about St. Charles Borromeo during the pandemic, whatever you want to call it, because he really was the model that priests should have followed. He was there during when the plague came to his city where he was the bishop, and he didn't close the churches, hide, run away, not take care of the sick. He went out to care for his people in his diocese. So he really was should have been the model that was followed. That was followed by some, by a few, but not many bishops or diocesan priests.
Yeah, he's and that's what I was saying about him being you can view him from
Yes,
so many different dimensions. There's so many different
yes.
stories. A great saint.
Yes, definitely. Well, before we get into our election roundup, we've been announcing each week our conference, CFN conference in Florida, March 1st and 2nd, on the theme of Father Dennis Fahey's writings on the great conflict between Christ's program for peace and the devil's plan for disorder, unpacking those elements of Christ's plan for peace and how the devil undermines them. We've been announcing our speakers. Today, we're going to announce Dr. John Rao. Dr. Rao is the greatest historian that I've ever known. He is really an amazing speaker and writer. He is the current organizer and main speaker at the Roman Forum, if any of you have been there in Gardone, Italy. And he is going to really lead off our conference with an explanation of the life, who Father Fahey was, his life, his work. And particularly, we've asked him to defend, as part of that, Father Fahey against the false accusations that have been made against him to try to discredit him. Tickets are on sale through Eventbrite. If you go to Eventbrite and just search Catholic Family News or Florida Catholic Family News Florida Conference, it will come up. This is the direct link. It's kind of long, but you can search and bring it there. You can buy tickets either conference only or with meals. And so far, we've announced Father Albert and Dr. John Rao, with more speakers to come.
Yeah, and if you want, for an easier way, you can also go to our website and just click conference at the top, and you'll be taken to a screen where you can just click the link to the conference and,
Yep.
go there.
Yep. Excellent. Well, we're in the final days.
Yes, it's been a major development on both sides of these campaigns. Um, there's been a lot of twists and turns. I think more than any other presidential election, possibly, with many monumental events, whether it be the assassination attempt or what we're going to start with is this new Kamala Harris campaign that came out of the Joe Biden campaign. So just for a little bit of a recap, I don't think many people have missed it, but just so we get our bearings a little bit. Of course, Joe Biden started off, everybody was saying that he had his faculties, that he was good to go for another 4 years, had a miserable debate performance. And of course, they had to, there was an emergency meeting of Democrats and they forced him out and ended up running with Kamala Harris. Now, at the beginning, there was a large amount of enthusiasm for Kamala Harris. The media gave her a lot of support. They went for even weeks, 2-3 weeks, just showering her with praise. They had admittedly, I will say, a decent outreach to youth, where they ended up actually seeming fairly together. They seemed to actually have rallied around Kamala Harris, and it seemed like a strong campaign effort. And for the first 2 weeks, or maybe even a month, it looked like she had a serious shot at really demolishing the Trump campaign on the other end of the aisle there. But what ended up happening was a number of just awful efforts on the part of this campaign. We saw a debate performance that wasn't exactly what she needed. We saw the hurricanes, I should say, that devastated the East Coast. And there was a number of mishaps that were done. During this terrible natural disasters on the East Coast, decided to make a number of questionable interview decisions, going on the Call Her Daddy podcast, which is this really degenerate podcast. And it seemed very frivolous to many for her to go on that to go on that podcast. At the same time, Tim Walz gave, I think everybody can recognize now, a miserable debate performance. It wasn't on the level of Biden's debate performance, but it was still quite terrible. And coming up now to these final days, she has not done many interviews at all. If she has, it's been sort of damage control. And the last minute, we've usually in these elections, we have what's called an October surprise. And that certainly has happened here, I would say, with a gift from the person that she stole this campaign from. And this was from Joe Biden. So Joe Biden was talking about in response to some things that were made at the Madison Square Garden rally that Donald Trump had. He said this about Trump supporters. We'll play it here.
Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization is seen as unconscionable, and it's un-American. It's totally contrary to everything we've done.
So there you see that he blatantly said the only garbage that he sees, and this is in response to something about Puerto Rico sort of being this garbage territory. What he said is the only thing I see that is garbage are his supporters. Now the way they've been trying to spin this is that he meant to say is that he simply misspoke, that he meant to say his supporters' comments. But as I think anybody can hear there, it's a lot easier to see when you actually look at him and when you see him and hear him. He does not misspeak. I don't think that's he doesn't seem like he corrects himself instantly. He says, the only thing I see that is garbage is his supporters. He leans back and pauses and then moves on to the next sentence. And his response to the outrage about this really wasn't satisfactory. His press office seemed to say something different than what he actually said, making it seem like there was an apostrophe after the supporters. But as everybody just heard, there really was a different sentence that he started. And Kamala Harris came out on the sort of runway after coming off of her plane and said that she wants to distance herself from this, that she does not agree with those sort of comments. We saw a number of Democrats do the same thing. And I think this was a major blunder on the Democrats' part. One can even speculate that this might have been sabotage on the part of Joe Biden, but that certainly was not a good look for her. Another thing I wanted to mention is her continual alienation of young men, which are a pivotal demographic here. She's down in young black voters, young black men, and especially young white men, as there's really nothing even appealing. Tim Walz, I don't think, made a successful appeal with his sort of video game streams that he's been doing recently. That's not going to be enough for the majority of young men who are starting families or trying to get rid of this awful economy. But also when it comes to that religious demographic, she made, I think, was a terrible blunder when asked about religious exemptions for abortion. Not even IVF, which has been a controversy in the Donald Trump campaign, but for abortion, she would not take a stance on that would say, oh, no, absolutely, there should be religious exemptions. So if I was predicting the election that's happening next week right now, I would say that there's a strong likelihood that Donald Trump will win a decisive victory. I don't think she has any momentum on her side. I don't think they did a good job this October of really giving a closing message. I think it was an unsuccessful campaign and an unsuccessful rally for the Kamala Harris campaign. So I would guess it's a decisive victory. I voted myself already for Donald Trump, even though I wasn't happy with a lot of the things we saw this entire campaign. I still did vote for Donald Trump, and that's my 2 cents on what's going to happen. What's your insight into this Kamala campaign and, of course, the Trump campaign, Brian?
Yeah, and I think Las Vegas agrees with you. The betting odds are pretty heavily they're putting in Trump's favor, so they seem to think he's going to win. But this really, her closing message has completely eliminated any issues, anything about what she do. I mean, essentially, her closing message has turned into Trump is horrible. Trump's unhinged. Trump is a fascist, and nothing positive. I mean, she sort of dropped the pretense that she even had of actually standing for something. Essentially, her message is, I'm not Donald Trump. Trump has actually ended pretty strongly. I'll pick up where you were with the major story about this comment of Joe Biden about garbage. Trump seized on this, I think, pretty effectively just yesterday. and he went to Wisconsin, a very important state, and he, instead of riding in a limousine, he was at the airport. He left in a garbage truck, dressed in a vest like a garbage man. I'll play this little video.
Made by really both of them, because there are really two of them, about being garbage, maybe 250 million people. They shouldn't be talking. That's like deplorable for Hillary. This is the deplorable for Hillary.
The deplorable for Hillary. And that was a major comment in 2016 that drove a lot of undecideds away from Hillary, that she just dismissed the people that vote for him as a basket of deplorables. So he went to a rally in Wisconsin. He kept the orange vest on and he said, "I'm here to collect the garbage. Are you ready to go?" And he just had, really turned this to his advantage, I think. In the only way he can do, just like he went to McDonald's last week and worked in McDonald's meeting people, because Harris claimed to work for McDonald's when she was in college, a claim that McDonald's says they cannot verify. He sort of then went and showed up there. So he's really a master showman. I mean, you have to give him credit, and he's really sort of driving home. Look, that's what these people think of you. These people think of you as deplorable garbage. And I want to be, he said, his message, president for all people. So while she's sort of narrowing her focus, he's trying to become broader in these final days. And he's done that with religious groups in particular. You mentioned religious exemptions. He's taken sort of the opposite view of Harris. He's strongly spoken about in recent days exemptions for religious groups, an expansion of exemptions, and even under one of the controversial things, he's got involved in IVF. He's pushed IVF, but he now says, look, if you're a religious hospital or institution, or you have a religious exemption, if you object to it, you don't have to have anything to do with it. So I think he's, again, realizing maybe he needed to broaden and reach out and reassure different groups. So he's really finishing strongly. He's appeared on a lot of forums. One that's gotten a lot of attention is Joe Rogan, obviously not a Republican, not really a conservative, but very popular podcast. He was on for almost 3 hours. I have to admit, I've not watched the whole thing. I watched some of it, but it's amazing. This guy can talk for 3 hours. But the parts I watched were very human. He tells the story about Joe Rogan's asking, what was it like when you first walked into the White House? And he tells a really, kind of very human story about what he said. I want to see the Lincoln bedroom. I've never been here before. And how he was so impressed with it, his impressions, and how overwhelming it was. He's very humble. He admits that one of the major things a president has to do is appoint about 10,000 people directly or indirectly. And he got some of those wrong. He really appointed people that shouldn't have been there, and he's learned his lessons. I think that was a very humble way to end, saying, I'll be, learned from my first term. He is all over Pennsylvania. I mean, he is everywhere. So he appeared right near St. Charles Borromeo school and church where I grew up, the grammar school I went to, which is, by the way, now closed because of the springtime of Vatican II. They had no children in the school and it shut down. But he was just there, I noticed, just the other day in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. He's really going into the final days with a lot of energy. He also, it was interesting in the Joe Rogan interview, he asked him, well, okay, if there were problems with the 2020 election, right? There were things that went on. What are you doing this time? And it's interesting. He's like, don't worry about it. But he didn't give a lot of specifics. And thinking about it, I think it was sort of like when they say, what are you going to do about the war in Ukraine if you get in? He says, I'll deal with it. I have a plan, but he doesn't tell you because he says, I can't tell you because then Putin will know. I almost wonder if he has people on the ground that are going to fight on Tuesday against corruption or cheating, but he doesn't want to really reveal how. That was the sense I got in that Joe Rogan interview, but that he's aware of the issue and is more aware than he was in 2020. Finally, we got a really good October surprise from the Supreme Court. Although, as I'll tell you at the end, I don't think it was all a surprise in how they ruled. So Virginia started in August going through a process of taking people off the voting registers who were apparently fraudulently on there because they're not citizens. they were registered to vote, but they're not American citizens. And they went through a case-by-case process, connecting with the Department of Motor Vehicles to get their citizenship information. Then the individual is notified, you appear not to be a citizen. If you give 2 weeks, if you can prove to us you're actually a citizen, we'll put you back. Otherwise, you're taken off. And there were, almost 2,000 people that they had removed from the register. The lower federal district court and the Court of Appeals ordered them to put all the people that they found were non-citizens back on the ballot. So literally on the ballot, on the red roll of voters, literally ordering them to let non-citizens vote. So they appealed to the Supreme Court on its emergency docket. 6 of the justices agreed. No opinion was issued. It was done as an emergency basis, but issued an injunction against the lower court ruling and said Virginia does not have to put these people back. So that is, I think, a good for Virginia, because there are several thousand people who should not have been voting who were able to walk in if this had not been done by the Supreme Court. Now, the arguments I want to give you, the liberals will say this is horrible. There's a federal statute on voting access that says you're not allowed to make sweeping changes to the voter rolls within 90 days of the election. You can individually, case by case, change people if you find out or have proof they're not eligible to vote, they're dead, they've moved, etc. But you can't just do a whole mass, we're just throwing all these people off because it's too close to the election and people won't have time to deal with it. And Virginia's argument all along is that's not what we were doing. This is case by case. Each person gets individualized notice, they can respond, and we put them back on. And the Supreme Court essentially agreed with that and said, yes, you are not violating federal law, and allowed them to go forward. So I think that is an example of what I think Trump's people, supporters, have been doing in various states. Youngkin, the governor, by executive order, ordered this. I think things like that have been going on in states where trying to get some of this voter corruption under control. And for example, non-citizens. So I think that was a good October surprise coming this week for Trump. And we will see. It's going to be a nail biter. Oh, I did say why I don't think it was so much a surprise. I think what we've learned from the Supreme Court's jurisprudence since 2020 on elections is they essentially say court shouldn't be involved. They refused to take every case that Donald Trump brought and that the state of Texas brought and all parties brought about the 2020 election. They just said, monkey see, don't see here. We're not having anything to do with it. And I think essentially that explains this decision. They just said the court shouldn't have been involved. Virginia did what it did. It's up to Virginia to decide who can vote. It's up to the states to run elections. We have nothing to say about it. Chief Justice John Roberts really regrets, I think, his Bush v. Gore decision in 2000 that resolved the 2000 election. And they, decided by their ruling that Bush would win. Essentially said, I don't want anything to do with elections anymore. And he's convinced the rest of the court, I think, to go along with him. So although it's a good thing for Trump, I think this, don't get too excited, the Supreme Court's going to help. I think this is consistent with what they've been doing, saying courts shouldn't tell states what to do. States can do whatever they want. 2020, that was crazy mail-in ballots with no verification arriving after Election Day. This happened to be a good thing, but I think they are consistent in that one thread. So that's my roundup on the Trump side. My prediction, I think Trump is going to win the vote, the electoral votes. I think it actually has a high likelihood to be even surprising. I think they're all focused on the 7 battleground states. My prediction is I think there's going to be a couple surprising states that are right now, if you look at maps, are like light blue or blue, that they think will be Democrat, that will flip over. Maybe New Hampshire, maybe Virginia, but I think there's going to be a couple surprises that are going to go into his total, is my prediction. Now, what happens after Election Day, a whole other story. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But I predict he's going to win the popular vote, I think. And I think he's going to have over 270 with maybe a surprising collection of states to get there.
Yeah, I want to point out one last thing because it is very interesting. I think the Trump campaign agrees with you. They have some interesting data because today, for example, he was in New Mexico. New Mexico is one of those lighter blue states, and nobody's projecting for him to win that. It's on the same line as Virginia or Minnesota, but I think they think that they could have a really good day on election day. And maybe as a final note, if there's a lot of traditional Catholics who are absolutely not, we're never going to vote for Trump. Maybe not a majority, but it's certainly there are some.
Yeah.
And I will just stress that there are some things you definitely should go vote for anyways. Many of these states have abortion just
Yes.
directly on the ballot. For example, here in Arizona, there was one certain proposition that would make abortion up till birth just completely legal. That's a yes or no vote. So I would still highly suggest to everyone, even if you're not on board with the Trump campaign, there are still propositions that deserve your attention and that you should still consider going to vote. I think that's part of our civic duty, to go and vote on those propositions. But as you said, this is going to be a nail biter no matter what. But I still, at the end of the day, think it will be a decisive victory, but it will require people going out and voting.
Yes, and very important. Even if you're not going to vote in the presidential election, those ballot measures may be even more important for the long-term future. In Florida, there's two constitutional amendments that are incredibly important. Proposition 4, which makes it a constitutional right for abortion up to birth, so that all the laws against abortion that have been adopted in Florida would be wiped out. You must vote no on that one. And Proposition 3, which I think they put on the ballot to get people out to vote for 4, to legalize marijuana. Honestly,
Mhm.
it was the ploy. Oh, yeah, I'll go vote for marijuana. And the people that are likely to vote for that probably in favor of abortion. But that will ruin the state, allowing I've seen it in other states. So vote no on those. And one final note, your congressman and senator really matter. I alluded to after the election. I do not put them some shenanigans in the Congress on certifying the election. If the Democrats get control, they will have an insurrection. So it's really important that he has a solid majority in the Congress to prevent them from doing something there. Well, before we go into our next story, we want to thank Angelico Press for sponsoring this program, making this program possible through their financial support. And as we do when they support our program, we want to highlight a book. They have a newly published book, which we want to highlight for you today. And that is a new um, translation of the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, and it's the first book of the Divine Comedy, the Inferno, and it's translated by Jason Baxter. This is really a one of the greatest works of Western literature, of Catholic literature. It is the Catholic epic. If you've never read it, you should read it, and you should start with the Inferno. Don't stop there, but you should start with the Inferno. And what I understand about this translation is again, originally Dante writes in Italian. It's the poetry and the rhythm are beautiful. Many of the translations have great accuracy, but you don't get that sense of the beauty of the Italian. Baxter's goal was to do both, to have an accurate translation, but one that captures the poetic genius of Dante. And from the acclaim the book's received, it seems like he's been very successful in that. So we have in the description of this video a direct link to purchase this, which will give you free shipping and also give us further support, because a portion of all proceeds from Angelico, when you use Catholic Family Code, come to support all of our apostolate. So thank you to Angelico Press.
And one thing on that, I think that's so important because our language has a great poetic capacity. And for example, the common translations you see, I have one here. This is Mark Muse's translation. It's a good translation, but you do lose some of the beauty that Dante was speaking of in his native tongue. And so, goodness, I'm buying this translation with this link. So it seems like a great project. So good on Angelico for producing it.
Definitely. Well, we're going to take a break from politics and go over to Rome. It was an eventful week in Rome, the end of the Synod on sin odality.
Yeah, this is this was I don't think anything was really surprising here, especially if you go back and listen to the old traditionalist talks on this that we were giving and the other traditionalist commentators were saying. Nobody was expecting some sort of Vatican III coming out of this synod, but I think everything sort of went as it expected. And I want to go sort of not line by line. It's a gigantic document, but it's extremely boring to read, I will say. But I wanted to go through some of the highlights or the lowlights of this document. So one thing that I really think encapsulates the whole thing is what's said in paragraph 5, which says the entire synodal journey rooted in the tradition of the church took place in the light of the conciliar magisterium. The Second Vatican Council was, in fact, like a seed sown in the field of the world and of the church. The daily life of believers, the experience of the churches and every people and culture. So this is what we've seen from a lot of the post-conciliar church, which is to root everything on Vatican II. This is really unheard of. It's not unheard of for people to reference a council when we're in a proximate closeness to it. For example, people were citing the Council of Trent and talking about the importance of its implementation. But to use terms like the conciliar magisterium implies that there's a sort of parallel magisterium. And it's very odd. Now, one thing to stress here is that, and it is important, it can be looked over. This is a magisterial document. This was they said so in the sort of preliminary remarks that if the Pope approved this, that it would be magisterial. There was a lot of uproar about there not being an apostolic exhortation in connection with this. But I really don't think it matters so much. This gets the job done for what they wanted to get done. I don't think they need an apostolic exhortation. Pope Francis can simply make this magisterial. It's not going to have any effect on the average person because, as we've talked about at length, and as you can see with our latest article we posted on our website from Canon Hess, an old talk that we have republished, if a old magisterial document that is of a higher weight contradicts one of these new magisterial documents, it's still you would give precedence to the one of the higher weight. So it's not that shouldn't scare anyone. Now, one thing that they, again, sort of a lot of this stems from, a lot of what we'll get into comes from this statement where they say, through baptism, all Christians participate in the sensus fidei, the sense of the faith. Therefore, in addition to being the principle of synodality, it is also the foundation of ecumenism. Now, that's I really don't see how this can be reconciled with Catholicism. And a big reason for that is because even though we might use faith analogically, we might say faith in the sense of, well, they believe, heretics, schismatics believe in Jesus Christ or believe in certain aspects of the faith. They do not have the supernatural virtue. This is something Catholics must believe. It's not a supernatural gift from God to be in heresy if you've separated yourself from the one true church. So, but that's what they're basing it on. They're saying everyone, if they're baptized, has this connection with the sense of the faith, the sensus fidei, and so has a sort of right to participate in this synodality and expression of the faith. Then they go on. A lot of people you might have seen on the internet were saying they called for a new mass. The answer to that is kind of. They sort of did that. It's a bit more complicated than that, though. They say, this is in paragraph 27, deepening the link between liturgy and synodality will help all Christian communities in the pluriformity of their cultures and traditions to adopt celebratory styles that manifest the face of the synodal church. To this end, we ask for the establishment of a specific study group to which we will also entrust a reflection on how to make liturgical celebrations more expressive of synodality. So that's, of course, very problematic. That's not just calling for us to pay attention to this in our interpretation of the liturgy, but it's certainly asking for a change, a certain liturgical change, which they're, of course, very, they love doing. We saw that with the Novus Ordo and the continual change that we see to the liturgy. I also think that has a connection to other things you can see on the Weekly News Roundup, such as the Amazonian rite that they're trying to put forward, or that Indigenous Australian rite that they're trying to put forward. I think their end goal really is to have a sort of local right for each of these communities that have that can adopt enculturation, which is of course contradictory to their other end, which is getting rid of the Latin Mass and establishing the Novus Ordo as the normative rite. But of course, making sense of this is simply impossible. Another thing that many people are going to point out, they make a number of practical resolutions asking for wider participation of lay people, and in the, for example, they say in a larger participation in the process of ecclesial discernment and decision making process. We don't exactly know what that means, and it doesn't seem they know either. It's this is supposed to be the document that clarifies all these things. Who knows what ecclesial discernment means? But they do call for specifically things like the increase of laymen and women to play the role of judge in the canonical process. We've talked about that before, and how strange that would be to have a number of lay women serving as a judge to a canonical proceeding for priests. It simply, that should go against the Catholic way of thinking. Moving on, this is the big one. This is the big one that everyone is talking about. In paragraph 61, they say, the question of women's access to diaconal ministry remains open. Discernment in this regard must continue. The Assembly calls for greater attention to be paid to the languages and images used in preaching, teaching, catechesis, and also in the drafting official documents of the Church, giving greater space to the contribution of women's saints, theologians, and mystics. I've seen a number of Pope-splainer types celebrating this, saying, you see, we've proved you wrong. They didn't establish the title of deaconess. But to me, this is about what we expected, but even worse than expected, I will say. What Brian and I have been saying is that they would establish sort of a deaconess in everything but name. Here, it seems like they're actually paving the way for an actual diaconal ministry for lay women, or for at that point, it would be an ordination of women. They're saying we're gonna put images in, use certain languages to sort of pave the way for that. I don't know how else you could read that. And then it says we're opening up the question, when before this question was closed, even by somebody like John Paul II. And the Church, many of the hierarchy, are interpreting it that way. As a final thing here, I wanted to highlight Cardinal Casper, where he recently says that he considers the ordinations of female deacons, so not just some role, some pseudo liturgical role, extraordinary minister gets called a deaconess. No, he wants a full on ordination of a permanent deacon for women. He says openly that he thinks it is scandalous for this not to be so. He says the fact that, as far as I know, the ordination forms for deacons and deaconesses were the same also speaks for this. So he here is talking about looking back in history at this role that was called a deaconess in the early church. The church came down hard against this. They said there should be no sacramental ordination for this. This is something that completely went out of practice. There was a legitimate deaconess practice at one time that was really something like an early form of being a nun or a religious sister, had very limited duties, certainly not like what we think of a modern permanent deacon or a transitional deacon. So that's simply absurd, and he is going against even what Pope John Paul II said about the church having no authority to ordain women in this sort of capacity, because ordaining someone a deacon is intricately connected with ordaining someone as a priest. So I think we're going to see more of this. I will say it's worse than expected on the diaconate front, but on the other things, it's to be expected. For the most part, it's mainly a bunch of undiscernible sludge that really we're not going to be able to get to the bottom of. I don't think they understand what they meant. But I don't know if did you have a different perspective on this, Brian?
No, I agree. And I think this paragraph is actually really important for the sham process they went through for two reasons. One, you already mentioned, Francis has thrown out the practice, I won't say traditional practice, the practice since Paul VI invented these synods is the synod happens, they have their document, and then the Pope says, oh, let me see what I'll take from this. And he picks and chooses what he would like to promulgate in an apostolic exhortation. Francis just immediately adopted it as his. And I think it's telling for the way he thinks, what his understanding of the papacy is. that the Pope is just a figurehead. He's like the Queen of England, who, when Parliament says what they want to do, just stamps their document for them to make it look official. I actually think that's kind of what he thinks in the doctrinal sense. The Pope's role will become in this head of the new world council of churches he's trying to turn it into. The next thing is, this paragraph, we're getting reports from Synod participants, was not in the document. On the final day, 1,000 amendments were run through the document before it was voted on. It reminded me of Obamacare, when Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats, told the congressman, they said, well, we haven't read the document yet. She said, we have to vote for it and you can read it later. How can you process 1,000 amendments? One of which was this, that added the discernment is open. And then finally, surprisingly, over a quarter of the participants voted against this paragraph. Now, you might think, well, that's not many, but Francis handpicked these people. These people, this is not representative of the church. He picked people to go to this synod. Again, he threw out all the old rules. He had lay people there voting. He packed the hall with his people. And you needed 33% to vote something down. They didn't get that. But again, you handpick the room. It would be like the Democratic National Convention having 25 of the delegates vote against Kamala Harris. Right? That's what the equivalent of that is. And I actually think that is telling, that this is so far out that even 25% of his handpicked people voted it down.
Yeah, and you mentioned something very key there, and we've talked about this on the show before about the Pope's different view of himself, and we've seen this in that Bishop of Rome document, and as the talks about this, giving more power to the Episcopal conferences. They do say this. They say that they need to reflect on the Petrine ministry, asking for a, quote, healthy decentralization, which they then ask, and this is something I think some cooler heads prevailed, because they did say that the things, for example, the pastor's questions, they want to leave to the competence of pastors the faculty of resolving in the exercise of their own task as teachers and pastors' questions with which they know well, and which do not touch the unity of doctrine, discipline, and communion of the church. But they go on to say, and this isn't talked about by the people who say, oh, you see, those traditionalists were scaremongering. They go on and say that they want to figure out which of these competencies need to be given to the Pope and to various bishops' conferences. And it's very ambiguous in typical Vatican II form. Well, are we talking about just various disciplines? To what extent does a discipline go before it touches matters of doctrine? We're going to see more and more this get abused, just as we saw things on the surface of Vatican II that might have seemed orthodox, or you could piece some things together to make it orthodox. It will get used in an improper way. Even these things where it seemed cooler heads did prevail, I think we're going to see abuse from it. Now, the other thing that we saw that was, this has caused such a scandal on many fronts, and for good reason, but in many ways this is distracted from this actual synod, and it was the unveiling of Luce. We see here this is our new mascot. So this is this little doll was unveiled to be to be the mascot for the Jubilee year of 2025. That it's, for the people listening, it's a little Japanese art, the small doll figure of a little girl wearing a rosary, blue hair, and wearing a raincoat, carrying a staff. And this has caused a lot of uproar, one, because of the ridiculous nature of it. It shows that the Catholic Church and its pastors has really lost a lot of the gravity that it used to have. There are certain roles we need to just get more serious as we step into them. Adults need to be more serious than children, and certainly the pastors of the church need to be a bit more serious than this. And there's also, I know many people sort of shriek when they hear this, but there is an underlying tone deafness to this that does have to do with the sex abuse crisis, because you have pastors that are unveiling as the mascot and sort of showing to everyone that this small little child figure, and this sort of art style, this Japanese art style. Anybody who has seen even various Japanese advertisements knows that to some extent this art style is sexualized, and those that might say that's not true, well, they've been proven wrong. And that's why the producer that has made this, we have on the screen now, from that very website, from the same person that made this doll that they contracted to make that doll to be the mascot, has been intricately involved with the Pride movement. You see on the left there the transgender flag, the LGBT flag, love is love, Pride. And so the people who are buying this doll presumably will also get advertisements for this Pride stuff. And they've also made, and we'll be careful to not to scandalize the viewers too much. This is a family-friendly show, but they've had certain objects that they sell on that website that violate the 6th and 9th commandment, or that are used to do that. And that's all done by this person that the Vatican contracted to make the mascot of the Catholic Church for the year 2025. I don't think I understand to many this might seem as coming down on fun, or trying to get rid of the cute things or fun things in the church, but there is a degree of prudence, and there's a degree of gravitas that the Church of God needs to have in these sort of matters. It really is. It shouldn't be that shocking, but even to me, I was sort of blown away that they were so bold in making that the mascot.
No, it is. It's absurd that they put this thing out. Again, it makes it worse with these connotations of the other art, if you call it that, this person has done. But it's cartoonish. I mean, it's like the symbol of the Synod that looked like Sesame Street. I mean, that's about how seriously these people are. That this is what they think is appealing. They are really lost the plot, and it's just a symbol of that. I mean, when I looked, it looked like that. I put up a little banner, that Disney Inside Out cartoon. That's what it looked like to me. I mean, it's just, is this the Catholic Church, or is it Romper Room?
Yeah, it's somebody in the comments, I noticed Paisley said it's a mascot to appeal to the kids and the teenagers. One thing to note is, to some extent, this wasn't even that. This is to appeal to adults. This is going to be used at an adult comic convention in Lucca. That's where they're going to unveil this. So it really makes us look bad, I think. I think most of the world is simply going to laugh at us, despite what the Pope splainers are. For example, if the Pope splainers saw the Eastern Orthodox say this, they would be making a mockery of them, saying that the Eastern Orthodox were a joke. Or if a Protestant group did this, of course, your average conservative Catholic would make fun of it. But when we do it, they make an excuse for it. The stuff just has to be called out. But I still think we can have a laugh at just the ridiculous nature of it.
Definitely. It to me, even though it came out about the Jubilee year, is the symbol of the Synod, I think. But, well, we're going to stay with some church matters and some old trad stories in new garb. Well, a debate which I think is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, to appropriate Shakespeare, has erupted in the blog sphere. It all started with Father Blingnière, who is a French priest, wrote an article saying he had a big idea for all the traditional minded groups in France. We should have a bishop. We need to ask the Vatican to set up a traditional ordinature that is headed by a bishop that can speak for us in Rome, can provide our sacraments. And he advocated this position in French in a publication in France. This then sparked a response from Dr. Joseph Shaw, the head of the Latin Mass Society, head of International Una Voce. He's appeared on our programs a few times, saying, no, this is a bad idea. This would put tradition in a ghetto. It would just sort of put the group, people there off to the side and would not be integrated into the full life of the church. And they had this debate. Well, the perspective I want to bring to this is, again, I think it's a debate that is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, and mostly because I don't know where these people have been for the last 30 years. This is not a new idea. This is the idea of Archbishop Lefebvre in 1988 that became the basis of the May 5th Protocol. He went to Rome when they asked him to come in 1988, and he said, tradition needs a bishop. Give us a bishop, and have the bishop. He wanted it actually to be a cardinal, not just a bishop, be our representative in Rome, who will speak on our behalf, who will provide ordination to priests when I'm gone. And the Vatican played games, sort of agreed, but then would never agree who the bishop would be. And eventually, Archbishop Lefebvre signed, but then withdrew his signature from the protocol and consecrated his own bishops. So you then know, group, 6 priests and some seminarians left the Society of St. Pius X. Eventually, some others would leave, Dom Girard from the monastery there in France. And they went to Rome, and Rome said, we'll give you the deal of Archbishop Lefebvre, the May 5th Protocol. Great, they said. They signed up. Except they never got the bishop. Never ordained never gave them a bishop, never gave them a protector. And the Vatican just said, you don't need a bishop. You're fine. So it in many ways, I think, showed Archbishop Lefebvre was right, that the Vatican was in bad faith, that they never intended this. Because if they said to these people who left the society, we will give you a bishop, we will give you the May 5th Protocol, the May 5th Protocol included the ordination of a bishop for tradition. Never got it, right? We're now, 1988, we're now in 2024. They've never had a bishop. So my first response is not really that of Dr. Shaw, though I appreciate his point of view, is, Father Blignier, where you been? I mean, you're still waiting for the bishop that was promised in 1988. Why on earth do you think the Vatican, because you just wrote this article, is now going to give you a bishop? They promised it and broke that promise 30 years ago. It's just not going to happen. And it's, I think, is a sign of desperation. They see, particularly in France, traditional churches under, again, Roche and his affiliates, I think, tried to get Francis to sign a document shutting down all traditional masses. Francis, as we've reported, pulled back from that. But they have just been, for the last 2 years, chiseling away. They wanted a grand solution. They didn't get it. They're chiseling away place by place to try to shut it down. And, I think they're just desperate. They know sometime they're coming for us. They've expelled the Fraternity of St. Peter from diocese. They've shut down Latin masses, diocesan masses, and it's just sort of a falling set of dominoes. And it's a last ditch effort. Well, maybe you'll come up with this great new idea that actually has been around for a long time and the Vatican's not interested in doing. I think it's, although it's gotten a lot of debate in the internet, I think it's going nowhere. And, that is not going to solve problems, because the Vatican's not going to do it. They've showed 30 years of not being willing to give tradition a bishop. Why? Because, as Archbishop Lefebvre knew, give them a bishop, tradition continues, because you cannot have new priests without a bishop, and that will ensure the survival of tradition. Meanwhile, a group that should know, the Dominican St. Vincent Fair from France, because they're one of these groups been around since the early days of Ecclesia Dei. They were also promised a bishop, have gotten nothing. They jumped on board to defend Father Blignier, attack Joseph Shaw, and, oh, this is so important, this is so great, and it would be wonderful, because we'd have our cake and eat it too. We would be part of diocese and the hierarchical structure, plus have our bishop on the side. It's sort of a strange. I mean, they've really lost the plot. I mean, I think, don't see what's going on in the world, and they should know better, because they've been around and they've never been given a bishop, and they're facing concerns about where their own ordinations will occur there as well. So I think this is, people are spending a lot of energy on it, and I think it's going nowhere. We've seen, Francis, I think, would have no interest in doing this. Ironically, the only people who may get bishops with his approval may be the Society of St. Pius X, as we discussed on our Q&A live last week. But before we go on, there's a second interesting component of this story. Did you have any thoughts on this this explosive
Yeah.
debate?
I wanted to answer a quick thing we had in the chat who gave us
Oh,
a
yeah.
super chat for $5. He said, Lord of the Rings 25 said, that is a great idea if they extended this to the formal Ecclesia Dei communities, several traditional cardinals and bishops. And this really goes into what I was going to say too, because I think as an answer to this, one problem that the Ecclesia Dei groups would have, including a group like the Society of St. Vincent Ferrer, who are Dominicans, so that everyone understands. Dominicans who aren't really Dominicans anymore, they're their own group so that they can have some, but not all, of the old Dominican traditions. I don't believe they keep the tonsure, though. There's some things they've left behind. But the one problem that all of them would have was they're not going to be able to agree on the essential matters relating to traditional Catholicism, namely, should one and can one attend the Novus Ordo Mass? That's a huge question, and that's a question that would be involved in the talks with Rome, and that I don't see them all coming to an agreement with. So, sort of this corralling of all the Ecclesia Dei groups into one group and then giving that group a bishop, I think in one sense it might be a positive thing for the church. I think it would be. I could see them doing it in response to the society getting bishops. If they did that, maybe as a way to compete with the Society of St. Pius X, and that would be a nightmare. But if that did happen, I simply don't see it being sustainable. I think you would see more fractures with, especially if they didn't get a cardinal. And as Brian mentioned, I don't see this coming in the future, because if they wanted to give the traditionalists a bishop, they would have already. But the truth is Vatican has a problem with the traditional groups because they suspect that they're against Vatican II, the synodal way, and the Novus Ordo Mass. So that's a major problem. But Lord of the Rings 25, thank you for that super chat.
Yes, and sort of as a connected to this story, kind of bizarre to me at this moment in time, the list of Traditionalist Custodes, a member of the Fraternity of St. Pius X, we're told in a communique from the Swiss district, has left the Society of St. Pius X to join the conservative, but what I'd say Vatican II oriented community of St. Martin, which is a group that is in Europe, although they do have a few apostolates, notably in Cuba, but in Germany is where I think he's joining. Father Udresi, Father Firmin Udresi. It is a little surprising because he's the former superior general. He was not superior general, district superior, excuse me, of Germany, and he therefore had a leadership position. The Swiss district said this was a great pain and loss to see him do this. I just find it bizarre, like this debate over, oh, maybe the Vatican's shutting us all down. Maybe they'll give us a bishop. Why at this moment, when all of these conservative Vatican II leaning communities are having pressure put on them to concelebrate, to accept the new mass, to move people to the new mass, shut down, would you jump ship now? Right. And again, I can completely understand 1988, very hard, very confusing for people. The Vatican's making all these promises, and some people said, you know what, maybe we should do this. Vatican's promising the world this consecration of bishops. My conscience is troubled. I think I would have stayed with Archbishop Lefebvre, but I can understand people doing that. It was a very hard decision, and they thought, I mean, look, Lefebvre signed the protocol and then realized Vatican was tricking him. It was plausible to say the Vatican's going to take care of us. But you again have 30 years of experience and Traditionis Custodes and the dubia about it, and the Vatican clearly contacting places, putting pressure on the nuns of Pontclair, having to go Novus Ordo. We've reported on that. Why at this moment would you jump ship to them? It's just, to me, it makes no sense.
Yeah, and if I can add just a quick thing on this, I think this might come across as overly simplistic to some people, but I think I've seen this with lay people as well. I've I've even seen people, seminarians who've been troubled over the example of thinking, scrupling over, well, am I in the state of schism? Even though the Society of St. Pius X has formal faculties from the Pope, am I in the state of schism by going to a society mass? What about 1988? I think something that really does solve all this, because as we've mentioned many times, this is a very uh, gray situation, and it's one that it's very difficult to get any sort of certainty in the crisis in the church. But if you read the Gospels and you try to do it every day, I think you'll find that our Lord Jesus Christ puts in some very solid principles that goes away from that legalism. The legalism, not in the sense that we get criticized for being legalism as simply following the doctrines of the faith, but the legalism of going and saying and ignoring that the salvation of souls has to come first, that your salvation is the most important thing. It has to come first, and everything else has to follow from that. In many senses, in many ways, I think that's what a lot of this debate is whether or not the salvation of souls comes first, or a strict interpretation of the law comes first, of canon law comes first, disciplinary matters. And that might come across as overly simplistic, but I think for most people, especially lay people, just reading the Gospels, I think we can get a greater understanding of that solid principle that our Lord puts forward.
Absolutely. And kind of analogous, if you're in the back of an ambulance dying of a heart attack, do you tell the driver to stop at a red light?
True.
Is how important is the law? Well, normally we do this in the middle of the show, but we had a long segment there. We've been pausing to give a little recommendations on art or music. So why don't we do that before we introduce our final premium show?
Yeah, I'm very excited for mine. This is a composer that some people are very fanatic about, but not a lot of people know, and it's Bruckner. Bruckner's Fourth Symphony, the Romantic Symphony, but one specific recording, 1951, conducted by William Furtwängler. So this is it here. It's a live recording, and the interesting thing about this is it was conducted and recorded in Munich, and it's in 1951. And the
Wow.
interesting thing to think about, Furtwängler was the conductor for the German regime under Hitler, even. And he had been struggling with that, trying to reconcile that with his own beliefs and his own love of music. And if you the spectacular thing I find about it is that everyone present would have just gone through the Second World War, and many of them would have been present. It's in Munich. That was the capital of I'm sure I don't want to say the name of the certain regime that gets us demonetized on YouTube, but people would have certainly been involved in being for or against it. And here you have this historic recording where, after the Second World War and the devastation of the World War, they come together and play this marvelous symphony that was done by a Catholic composer, I should mention. Bruckner was a Catholic, and a devout Catholic as well, one that took his faith seriously. The music itself, it's reminiscent on the Viennese outside, the Viennese landscape that Bruckner was very familiar with. And also, he's one of the greatest composers to really show that spirituality, his Catholic spirituality, and I think it shines through in that recording and also the symphony itself. So I'll have a link to that in the description. But what have you got for this week, Brian?
Great. I'm actually going to talk about some art that you may not be familiar with, which either if you can get to the Vatican to see, or you can look in a book or pictures, and that is Raphael's stanza. The stanza were a series of rooms in the Vatican apartments that Julius II engaged Raphael to paint at the same time that he also hires Michelangelo to do the Sistine Chapel. And one room in particular, the Stanza della Signatura, I think is a beautiful example of Catholic art to show the unity between philosophy and theology. So in the room, in the stanza, there's two frescoes that face each other. There's four walls, so two that face each other, two large ones, and then two small ones. The two large ones are this first, the School of Athens, showing philosophy. So the great philosophers of the ancient world, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, there, and they are in this sort of dispute, this philosophical discussion. Then opposite, so looking at um, that picture of philosophy is a equivalent of theology. It is a disputation. Disputation is a scholastic term for a debate, right? A debate about the nature of the Blessed Sacrament. And I'm going to pull that up. The disputation over the Most Holy Sacrament here, and this is in the opposite wall. So you get all of these saints down on earth, right? Discussing it with the Blessed Trinity represented above. And again, this at the bottom of it's a little cut off. I think here there's the monstrance itself on the altar, as you can see there. On the other two walls, just is the Parnassus, the muses of poetry and art and literature, facing the cardinal virtues. And so the whole room, as beautiful you can get in to see it. It's if you go to the Vatican Museum, it's part of it, but it's closed a lot of days. But when you just stand there and see this how the Catholic life pulls art and virtue, philosophy and theology into a harmony, it's so beautifully represented by Raphael.
And it's sort of spoiled by on the left there, we have the Synod image, the image of that Synod, that Sesame Street on the left on the Vatican website. So
Oh,
we
yeah,
see
you're right. Look at that. I didn't even notice that, but that's yeah, that says a lot. Well, our fourth story, which will be over in locals if you've lasted this long with us, is new persecution of the traditional Carmel in Arlington. A big update to that story this week. So join us on locals in just a minute. I mentioned the novena. Please, if you haven't started, do it the last couple days. If you have, continue to pray to the Sacred Heart for our country. We will also entrust the election, most importantly, those ballot measures to protect the laws against abortion that are being put up for votes in many states. And secondly, that a leader who will work for the common good is given to us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Eternal Father, I offer you the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ and all the instruments of his holy passion, that thou may put division in the camp of thy enemies. For as thy beloved Son has said, a kingdom divided against itself shall fall. St. Charles Borromeo.
Pray for us.
Our Lady of Fatima.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Well, thank you. Have a wonderful feast of All Saints. And those watching us on locals will, as soon as this program ends, we'll get you our fourth bonus story. God bless you all. See you next week.